Last night I was able to see Killers of the Flower Moon, the latest Martin Scorsese film. Actually, it's the first Martin Scorsese film I've ever seen in the theater, so it was a pretty cool night. So let's talk about it. While I'm talking, be sure to let me know your thoughts on Killers of the Flower Moon down below in the comments section. Now, obviously, Martin Scorsese is one of the greatest directors of all time. The last couple of months, I've been doing a deep dive into his filmography, and I've watched all of his films. Actually, I've still got two I still need to finish. And while watching the films, I've also been reading through two books to give me perspective, and I've watched hours and hours of interviews from him about his individual films as well as his thoughts on directing as a whole. And this whole journey has culminated in being able to see his latest film, but was it any good? You probably already know the answer to that question, but how good was it? Before I answer that question, today's video is brought to you by HelloFresh. With HelloFresh, you can get farm-fresh, pre-proportioned ingredients and seasonal recipes delivered right to your doorstep. HelloFresh does all the planning and shopping for you. Their ingredients arrive at your doorstep pre-proportioned and ready to cook, along with pictured step-by-step recipe cards. The instructions are simple enough that a new cook like me could still figure it out. My fall has been jam-packed. I have 3 kids at 3 different schools plus extracurriculars. We don't have extra time. HelloFresh makes whipping up a home-cooked dinner actually doable with quick and easy options, including their 15-minute meals. That's less time than it takes to get delivery. All 5 of us, including all 3 kids, loved it, and the kids actually wanted more. That's huge! Go to HelloFresh.com/50SeanChandler and use code 50SeanChandler for 50% off plus free shipping. HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit, and you can get your order for 50% off plus free shipping at HelloFresh.com/50SeanChandler and use code 50SeanChandler. With that said, let's get started with the good. When it comes to this film, you're talking about one of the greatest directors of all time, directing a top-notch cast with a budget of $200 million while adapting a successful book about a compelling real-life story. Naturally, there's a lot of potential here for something special. And at the heart of it is this very interesting, compelling, and horrifying real-life event. I was not familiar with this particular story prior to seeing the film, and so it was all new information for me, but it's one of the earliest murder investigations of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover, and it's from such a specific moment in history with such unique details that it's just captivating to see all of these different dynamics coming to play in this single story. At its core are just these captivating power dynamics where this Osage Indian tribe were incredibly wealthy because they found oil on their land. Thus, because they were wealthy, they were very powerful. But they didn't control the government, banks, police, or hospitals. That was controlled by the outside Americans who wanted access to their money. But because these outside Americans controlled the societal structures, they had power. And that's kind of the context where all of this is taking place, where you have one group of people trying to take the wealth from another group through all of the external control that they had to be able to get away with such heinous actions. But along those same lines, that's exactly what makes it just so devastating as you're seeing the consequences of greed and racism coming together that just creates this story that feels hopeless. Like, we got about 2 hours into this movie. I don't really know how far into the movie. It was pretty deep into the film. And I started thinking, like, if they're not able to turn some of this around, I think I hated this movie. Now, by the end of it, we're okay, but it just gets so bleak and dark, and you just feel like you have no control because they had no control, and there's so much just depravity and wickedness happening, and there's nowhere to turn to make it right. You just keep waiting for some of these characters to do the right thing. You keep waiting for justice. About 30 minutes into the film, you start getting this sick feeling in your stomach, like, oh, is that what this is? Oh, is that where this is going? And it doesn't really let up until the credits. Like, you just keep that feeling in your stomach, and then you keep remembering, oh, this really happened. And once again, you feel sick to your stomach at man's depravity and man's inhumanity to man, and the depths to which our greed can drive us to do such sick, sick things. But also in the context of all of this, as you're telling the story, it's able to have kind of this earned paranoia, where you have the Osage people that know there's people conspiring against them, but they have nowhere to turn. If they leave, they lose their land, and they've lost their land before. There's no authorities that they can turn to. There's no investigations that will be done. When they've tried to bring in outside help, it hasn't worked. And so there's this sense of paranoia. You don't know who's out to get you. You don't know who's actually a friend and who's against you. And even in kind of these families, you just don't know who's on your side exactly. That just keeps you feeling sick to your stomach, but also on the edge of your seat. Similarly, because of the context of all of this, it has these characters that are so dense. In particular, like the conspirators and everything going on, they have these elements of genuine friendship and love for other people that they seem to truly, behind closed doors, enjoy the people that they're committing wretched, grotesque acts against. There's this disconnect of enjoying someone as a human and utterly stripping them of their humanity and treating them as below them in another sense, and repeatedly referring to them as savages while choosing to act in a savage manner themselves. It's compelling as you're just watching this enormous cognitive dissonance that just makes you sick. And as I mentioned before, you're waiting for some of them to piece it together. You're just waiting for them to realize how wrong and evil this is. And you're waiting for a long time because it doesn't happen. And on the flip side, from the very beginning, the Osage people are well aware that these white outsiders have come and they're after their money. They know it, they say it, they call it out in the movie, but still they're wooed by the friendship and modern society, and they keep intertwining in ways where you're thinking to yourself, oh no, what are you doing? How could you not see where this is headed? Please stop, please stop. But that's what makes you kind of get sucked into this world of everything going on, because there's always so many layers to it. And it's so detailed. It does have a long runtime. We'll talk about that in the later part of this review. But because it's such a lengthy film, there's so many details within the families, within the community, within societal structures, within each group's kind of worldview, within friendships. So many details in this intricate web of friendships, families, betrayals, paranoia, all of it. And it's compelling and interesting. Big one you also have to talk about on here, if you're going to talk about these dense characters, are these transformative performances where you have Leonardo DiCaprio that we've seen in so many different roles, and then you believe him as this pretty dumb character that's very low status in many regards, but marries into a family with money. And you buy into him, his simplicity of who he is. And despite having seen him as far more intelligent characters, far more sophisticated characters, he transforms into this dull person in another regard. And likewise, having watched through all of Scorsese's films over the last couple of months, I've seen all these different performances from Robert Downey Robert Downey Jr., that's someone entirely different. In between reading these Scorsese books, I'm listening to the book on the history of the MCU, in which case my brain is confusing Robert Downey Jr. and Robert De Niro, who likely will both be nominated for Oscars and be competing against each other early next year. So I've seen all these different performances from Robert De Niro, not Downey. And once again, he transforms into such a different character that's nothing like the gangsters, boxers that he's played in the past, and has a different accent, a different vibe, but is still equally believable in this role. And he plays a character that is so performative in how he wants to be perceived in his community. So there's both playing the person, but playing the person wants people to perceive him as in the performance. So there's a lot kind of going on in it. Once again, letting us know he's one of the greats. Other one you got to talk about here is Lily Gladstone, who is playing up against these two top actors and playing a character that's much more subtle and absolutely holding her own in finding ways to come off as affable and fun and amusing, as well as intelligent, mischievous, and heartbroken and in desperation, but all in very subtle ways. It's all clear exactly what's going on, but without needing this big overt gestures.
The whole visage, the face, her intelligence. One could see that there's a lot going on in her face, but her not doing very much.
And that's what makes her performance in this movie really good. Playing off who she's playing against without being able to do as transformative and big things as they're doing, but being just as compelling and interesting as them in the film.
You talk too much.
I don't talk too much. Thinking who I got to beat in this horse race.
So when you have a master storyteller working with fantastic actors, compelling a story with so much complexity and emotional resonance, you get a powerful, compelling film, and that's what this is. But it's also a movie where there's a lot more to kind of tackle here, and it is tackling a lot. And because of that, there are some choices that might not entirely work for some people. So let's move on to the mixed aspects of the film. So Killers of the Flower Moon is based off of a book of the same name that came out a little over 5 years ago. And I haven't read the book, but based off several interviews with Martin Scorsese and articles that I've read, the book is told from the perspective of the FBI agents doing the investigation. Thus, there's a series of reveals. As the FBI learns new information, the audience learns that information. The creators of the film, after spending 2 years working on the script, decided that they didn't want to tell the story from the perspective of outsiders, but from the perspective of the community itself. Scorsese told Variety this: "Myself and my co-screenwriter Eric Roth talked about telling the story from the point of view of the Bureau agents coming in to investigate."
But there was something about it that we've been there before, and that was the idea of a police procedural.
After 2 years of working on the script, Leo came to me and asked, "Where is the heart of this story?" I had had meetings and dinners with the Osage, and I thought, well, there's the story.
I said, the heart is with this guy, Ernest, and his wife, Molly.
The real story, we felt, was not necessarily coming from the outside with the Bureau, but rather from the inside from Oklahoma.
I said, the only problem there is that it's a creative problem, which is you take the script, you turn it inside out. And how much of procedural do you need? Not very much.
So instead of the story being an investigation, it's more matter-of-factly just showing you what happened. This essentially removes any intrigue or mystery from the story. That's not inherently a bad thing, but something is lost, and if that's something that you enjoyed about the book, it's not really present in the film. And if you're going in expecting this true crime exploration, that's not the direction that they went with the film. I was talking to a friend of the channel, Sydney. She is someone that has read the book. And essentially what she said was there's a bunch of things that in the book are mysteries and big reveals. And in the film, it's pretty clear from the very beginning what's going on. Essentially, certain things that would be major spoilers in discussing the book are just the setup for the film. They're not spoilers whatsoever. And on that point, if you want the perspective of someone who has read the book, check out Sydney's review over on her channel. But all this to say that there's some choices here in how they went about telling the story that some people will be disappointed in particular if they read the book, or if you're wanting a mystery investigation out of this film. It's not really about that. It's much more about the characters, the community. That's where the heart of this film is at. From there, let's move on to the bad. And the first thing that comes to mind here is the length. It's 3 hours and 26 minutes long. It's a very long film. I believe it's the second longest Scorsese film, right behind The Irishman. And in the case of like The Irishman, which I also would say probably would have been better if it was a bit shorter, that movie was tackling like 4 decades, a whole bunch of gigantic, big, complex events. And so you could kind of understand why that one was so long. Whereas this is a much tighter series of events, fewer locations, fewer characters, more condensed time frame, but just as long of a runtime. Very early on in the film, you get a pretty good idea where things are headed, but it still takes a long time for things to really kick into motion. And you're over 2 hours into the film before you really even start to have an investigation. The longer it goes on, the more compelling it gets. So when you're like 3 hours into this movie, that's when you're most like on the edge of your seat, connected, like, oh man, oh man, oh man, what's gonna happen? But it also means my mind was wandering from time to time in the first 90 minutes of the film. Now, can a top talent director with a top cast and an enormous budget make a movie that's still compelling at a very long runtime? Sure. But is this runtime the best possible runtime to tell this story? I would say probably not. A tighter version, in particular, tightening up the first 90 minutes, would be a better version of this film. And Scorsese has said in some interviews that he was influenced by Ari Aster in the pacing of Midsommar and Beau is Afraid. As someone that's not a big Ari Aster guy, I don't take that as a good thing. I think we could have moved a little bit quicker in the first half and gotten to the investigation sooner. Second thing here, as I mentioned earlier, they decided not to tell the story from the perspective of the FBI agents, but from the perspective of the community itself, which means we spend all of our time with the Osage families, the conspirators. We're like right there in the middle of it, seeing this community. And I felt like I never really understood the characters. Like I talked about how they're compelling because of their density and multiple layers that they have, but I also felt like I never really understood fully what was going on. And we're spending so much time that we see what's going on. We see all these conflicting emotions and responses to people, but never felt like I got under the surface to understand it. And I think that's something you really need if you're going to choose to tell the story like this. The duplicity of the conspirators and the trust of the Osage people, it never fully added up. It's so obvious to the audience what's going on and who stands to benefit from the murders. And you can see the path. It's very clear. It's not subtle. And so it just feels like there's just gigantic disconnect, that there's certain trust that people still have for one another. And I think if you tell this story from the perspective of the FBI agents, where there is a bigger gap, this isn't really a problem because you're not spending the time in all of it. So you don't see their day-to-day life. But as soon as we're right there and we see how certain events emotionally drain people, and then immediately afterwards, we continue to see their cognitive dissonance without getting under the surface and understanding what was going on there. How could they be like that? I think there was just something missing there if you're going to tell the story from this perspective. And I think also on this same point, they said that they wanted to tell the story from this perspective, not the FBI agents, because the heart of the story is the Osage people. It's their story. but they still feel like side characters in their own story here.
As an Osage, I really wanted this to be from the perspective of Molly and what her family experienced.
Because Leo is our main character. He's the character that we see primarily his perspective on all of this, not theirs.
But this story is being told, this history is being told almost from the perspective of Ernest Burkhart. And they kind of give him this conscience and they kind of depict that there's love. But when somebody conspires to murder your entire family, that's not love.
And I think there's just a missed opportunity there. And I never felt like I fully even understood him. I saw the two sides. I saw the love, I saw the greed, I saw a lot of things in him, but I never felt like I understood him beyond the simple idea that he's greedy and he's stupid.
Then I said, oh yeah, the story really is the relationship of Ernest and Molly and the betrayal. The only problem is we don't know anything about Ernest. Everybody else have got tons of material on. We don't know anything about him.
I never got that deeper layering to it. Final one I would talk about in here, this is the least important of them, but there is some distracting casting. You get over 2 hours into the movie, and all of a sudden you hear John Lithgow's voice, and I was like, wait, is that John Lithgow? And then it cuts to John Lithgow. I was like, oh, there he is. And I'm thinking about the casting, not the character. And then not too long afterwards, the camera pans over, and you just see Brendan Fraser sitting at a desk out of the nowhere. And that's what you think. The pans over to Brendan Fraser, not it pans over to this character. And it's not that they did a bad job. It's not that I think they were bad in the film, but the way that they're introduced calls attention to the casting. And there's one more at the very end of the film where it just draws attention to the casting, who's doing something, rather than the character or the events or the dialogue itself. Real quick before I give you my final thoughts, remember to join me down below in the comment section. Share your thoughts on Killers of the Flower Moon, and if you've read the book, let me know your perspective on the film as someone that knows the story from the book's perspective as well. Also, remember to come back this weekend. I will be doing a ranking of the Martin Scorsese films. This has been one of the most requested videos that I've had for years. It's finally happening, and I've tried to make it as big of a deep dive as I can, and really trying to get to know these films, both experiencing them, hearing his perspective on his films, as well as the thoughts of others. Can't wait to put it out. When you put it all together, Killers of the Flower Moon is another great film from Martin Scorsese. The performances are top-notch. The story itself is compelling, complex, and gut-wrenching. I don't think this is a new modern classic. It's not necessarily one of the top-tier, groundbreaking Martin Scorsese films, but that doesn't change the fact it's easily one of the best films of the year. Overall, it's an A-. It's a 9 out of 10 on the entertainment scale, and you should see this film in the theaters if you're prepared to watch a very heavy and long drama. Remember to check out the details on HelloFresh down below at that link down below in the description. And if you want to hear my thoughts on all of Scorsese's films, come back this weekend. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies and TV too much.